Hi, it's your friend Joseph Craven here for Running Out the Clock to get a little deeper into the key for Mississippi State's success this season, quarterback Nick Fitzgerald. Nick Fitzgerald has emerged under the tutelage of Dan Mullen as one of college football's unexpected star players. Going into his redshirt senior year, Fitzgerald is just a few years removed from being completely ignored out of high school, where he ran a wing T triple option style offense and very rarely actually passed the ball. Dan Mullen looked at him and said, I can develop him into somebody. And Mullen, of course, has that reputation for developing good quarterbacks, so it made sense. But nobody expected Fitzgerald to come in after having one scholarship offer to UT Chattanooga, I believe, and do what he has done so far. Leading into this season, there have even been some pundits that are trying to build up, potential Heisman hype, much like they did with former Mississippi State quarterback Dak Prescott. And that's probably a bit of a stretch, considering this is a tricky transition with a brand new head coach and a new offensive scheme to run. But Fitzgerald has proven that he has the talent, the work ethic, to be able to work through a lot of these issues and prove his worth as a player. The Bulldogs return a significant amount of starters on both sides of the ball this year, so a lot of people are expecting them to make a splash in the West, possibly landing in the third spot, maybe even making a push to be second in the West this season. So much of that comes down to whether or not Nick Fitzgerald in his senior year can lead the Dogs the way people are expecting him to in Joe Moorhead's offense. So there's a lot of questions here. Is Fitzgerald ready? Is he recovered from that injury last season that knocked him out of the matchup against rival Ole Miss? And what does he need to work on in order to really make this season work out? Any jabroni on the street can tell you that the key to Nick Fitzgerald's progression as a player in his senior year is to prove that he has the arm to lead a team. This especially comes down to whether or not he can make it as a pro. He's getting a little bit more professional attention than Dak Prescott did because he has some of those intangibles. In fact, Nick Fitzgerald might be the most physically gifted quarterback that Dan Mullen has ever had. He stands towering over other quarterbacks such as Alex Smith, Chris Leak, Dak Prescott, by at least a few inches. These guys all clocking in at about, 6 foot to 6'2". Fitzgerald, 6'5", 230 pounds. He's like a slimmer, slightly taller, and probably faster version of Tim Tebow. And if that's the type of comparison that gives you worry when it comes to development as a passer, then it makes sense. That is what we have to investigate with Nick Fitzgerald, and that's what we're going to look at here in this particular deep dive into Mississippi State football. But like I said, any jabroni can tell you, he needs to prove he's a good passer. We're not going to do that. We're going to get into his strengths, his weaknesses, the scheme, the personnel around him, and we're going to see what kind of verdict we can come to as to what would make this season a success for Fitzgerald, what he has to do in order to make this a very good year. Now, the NFL archetype that is kind of being developed right now for the quarterback of the future follows Carson Wentz, Cam Newton before him, and, Mississippi State alum Dak Prescott, then Fitzgerald certainly fits that mold. And that's promising enough. His strengths that he has, mostly his physical gifts. He has size, speed, and really good arm strength. So let's look at number one, his most outstanding ability, his running ability. This running ability was fully on display under Dan Mullen because Mullen's offense centered around having a mobile quarterback who can make read options correctly and quickly and run up and down the field. Sort of a power run-based spread offense. Now, his speed is very interesting because Fitzgerald isn't like Johnny Manziel or Lamar Jackson in that he is shifty, athletic, has great change of direction, makes defenders miss, that sort of thing. And he's not quite like Dak Prescott, who had the overall size to be able to plow through a defensive line or over defenders. He's kind of in between on all those guys, but where he excels is just flatline speed. He might be the fastest out of all of these guys just in flat line speed. He honestly has, comparisons drawn to the way like an Olympic runner would run in a track and field event, mostly because of his height and his long legs. Not really so much because he has Olympic caliber speed. That's obviously not what we're saying here. But with that height, with kind of his upright running, with his long legs, long stride, that's the type of style of running that you see here. You see a guy that as soon as he gets a bit of a step, then he can just flat out run past you. He's not going to make you miss. He's not necessarily going to plow over you. He can do that to an extent, especially that second thing, using his size and strength. But where he excels is open field running right past you. He can bust a long run in that regard. And you don't realize it. You really don't notice how fast he's actually moving because he doesn't look like it. He's one of those guys that doesn't look like he's picking up speed at all. He just kind of moves his legs. The next thing you know, it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, he's 15 yards down the field. How did that happen so quickly? So his strength is not just in how fast he is, but also how deceptive he is and how quickly he can move. This has to be the type of thing that Joe Moorhead looks at and salivates a bit over because Trace McSorley is a quarterback he was able to do a lot with. McSorley, mobile enough to rack up a few hundred yards of rushing in the past couple of seasons. But Moorhead right here in Fitzgerald inherits a runner who has clocked already over 1,000 yards rushing in his first year as a starter, almost 1,000 last season before getting injured and missing most of the final game of the season and a bowl game. Averages of 7.1 and 6.1 yards per carry when rushing. This opens up something for Moorhead that he hasn't necessarily always had, in that he has a more dynamic runner at quarterback. So you got to think that even if Fitzgerald's trying to prove his worth and trying to lead his team to success by throwing the ball more efficiently, throwing the ball better this season, you got to think that in all of that, his ultimate strength still lies with his ability to run the ball. His secondary strength, however, is his overall arm strength. This is what got overlooked a lot in the recruiting process. What he wasn't really able to show off much coming out of high school was just how much velocity he can put on a pass. This is something that stood out a little bit his redshirt freshman year when he came in as the backup to Dak Prescott in a particular victory over Troy, where late in the game, Fitzgerald comes in, he scrambles off to the side, and he is able to, on the move, hurl a bomb pass to Donald Gray, who at that point in time was also a newcomer to the team. It was a 49-yard pass on the run, and it really at that point showed everyone, oh, well, this kid actually does have a cannon. He does have the arm strength that you want to see in maybe a potential pro quarterback. The questions have always been whether or not he could harness that, which are incredibly valid questions to ask. But if we're talking about his strength, his arm strength is a strength. God, I really need to have written that better. Fitzgerald hasn't always been able to show off that arm strength because, well, for a couple of reasons that we'll get into in a little bit more detail later on. But Mullen, for example, didn't use as much of a vertical passing game, and Mullen also never really had wide receivers that fit a vertical passing game. In fact, really the only deep ball threat that Mississippi State has had in a number of years, especially under Fitzgerald's tenure, was Donald Gray, who spent a good chunk of last season injured, and then of course has graduated and moved on. So Fitzgerald's arm strength has not really been able to fully be on display so much at this point in his career. And that's what the senior year kind of promises to maybe demonstrate to everyone who isn't aware of this. So if you've got a tall, fast, big, weight-wise, quarterback with a very strong arm, well, then you can see why exactly some people are giving him potential NFL hype and are thinking that if everything comes together, this could be a season that earns him some awards. But what about the weaknesses? What are the details here in Fitzgerald's game that can come up as being things he can improve on? I mean, if you look statistically speaking, the most yardage he's passed for in a season so far is a hair under 2,500 yards, and his completion percentage has always been around 55%. They're not dynamic passing numbers. A lot of this comes down to the fact that the way his arm is, it didn't always fit with Dan Mullen's offense, so Dan Mullen asked him to run the ball quite a bit, and he ran it very well. He set a lot of rushing records for the school. So the weaknesses here are the fact that if you've got a really, really strong arm, sometimes you can lack touch on the shorter and intermediate passing routes. The problem here is that that's a lot of what the offense has been for the past several years. It's where Dak Prescott excelled as a quarterback and what got him to be a very successful rookie his first year in the NFL, because he was ready to complete those short and intermediate level passes, those complex routes, and do it with efficiency without making mistakes. Dak Prescott, for his career, had a completion percentage hovering around 63%. So you got this guy that Fitzgerald's replacing and doing better than in some areas, in particular rushing, but also is just not completing passes at the same rate. And it's really because, I mean, obviously they're two different players, but they're two different styles of quarterbacks as well, when it came to passing the ball, at least. Fitzgerald, in particular, lacks a lot of control and touch in those short-range and medium-range passes. You see many times in which the ball looks like it really wants to travel several yards farther than it does. And that leads to a lot of wide receivers failing to catch the ball, or wide receivers not being able to control it in time to make a move if it is a particular route that then leads them into the open field. There's several different reasons here as to why this is an issue, but obviously if you are very, very good at the deep ball, but your coach wants you to throw the mid-range ball or wide receiver screens a whole lot more, then it means you're not really playing to your strengths quite as much, and it's going to be reflected in the statistics. So the first weakness to work on here is obviously just better touch in the short and intermediate range passes. This isn't terribly uncommon. I mean, look, for example, at some of the top NFL quarterback picks in the past several years. The players that the NFL tends to gravitate towards, even still, are the bigger guys with the super strong arms. They think that, you give them time, they're going to figure out how to just be a little bit better passer in terms of having that, touch and control on those passes. But if you've got that strong arm, then you can build something around that. So far in the college game, that's not really the case. If you want to be a successful college quarterback, you got to be able to minimize mistakes and operate an efficient level in that short and medium range area. Obviously, we have quite an issue here. If that is, maybe one of the biggest keys to being a successful college quarterback, and it happens to be two of the areas in which Nick Fitzgerald struggles the most. Obviously here, though, we do need to backtrack and, maybe define a little bit of what's a successful college quarterback in this sense, because he's a successful guy, he's setting records, he's winning games. A lot of that is with his feet. He's a winner. And this would be, whether or not he could take the next steps to be a better quarterback and, future pro maybe, or at least this season, win more games, live up to the hype that people are building about the program. He's a good football player. How can he be a better quarterback is the question here. And it's an oversimplification to say he needs to get better on the short, medium, intermediate range passes, and needs to cut down on his interceptions. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that it's hard to really read too deeply into statistics when it comes to these things, because, yeah, he may have thrown 11 interceptions to only 15 touchdowns last year, but how many of those interceptions were actually his fault versus pass deflections, wide receiver mistakes, that sort of thing can always happen. And also, how many times did he run for touchdowns as opposed to passing touchdowns? As a sophomore, he had 21 passing touchdowns, 16 rushing, and 10 interceptions in that. You have an almost even touchdown to interception rate, which is not really where you want to be. 2017, in the, 11.2 games that he was in, he had 15 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, 14 rushing touchdowns. So even if not all those interceptions are his fault, because interception tallies are very rarely 100% a quarterback's fault. It's still this issue of he needs to tone down on those. He needs to control the ball a little bit more. Needs to be more efficient. Yet, in light of, some other comparisons that we'll get to in a minute here, he's also dealing with a much smaller sampling. Mullen really, really wanted him to run the ball. That's kind of the, summation of it. And not just him, but also running back Aries Williams. We'll get to the comparisons in more detail in a minute, but the gist of it is, as a junior, Dak Prescott attempted 396 passes. As a senior, 477. So far, Fitzgerald has had 361 and 286 pass attempts. Compare that to Prescott's junior year, where he rushed the ball 210 times for 986 yards, and Fitzgerald rushed 195 times for 1,375 yards in his first year as a full-time starter. So the most carries that Prescott got and the most carries that Fitzgerald got, Fitzgerald was a better runner, a more efficient runner, tallied up more yardage and a higher, rate of yards per carry. So you see here that Mullen ran the ball a lot more with Nick Fitzgerald and Aries Williams than he did pass the ball. And then, there's no way of knowing whether or not that's because Mullen just trusted Prescott as a passer more by the time he was a junior and senior, whatever it may be. But the fact of the matter is, Fitzgerald has some of the tools to throw a long ball well, to outrun players. And so, Mullen kind of gravitated towards those a little bit. But Mullen really, really loved the power running and called a lot more running plays just in general. Probably some 60% of Mullen's play calls were running plays. So whether or not that is Mullen working around Fitzgerald's weaker points in his game, or if that's just Fitzgerald not fitting quite as well in Mullen's style as Dak Prescott, it's really hard to tell, but the fact of the matter is, those are the areas that you see most specifically that Fitzgerald needs to work on, and that Moorhead needs to target if he wants to get the most out of Nick Fitzgerald, like we know he does. If you compare the two coaches, which we'll do now, we've gone through strengths and weaknesses. If you compare the two coaches, you look at the fact that Moorhead tends to be much more even 50-50 run and pass. Along with that, he just uses personnel differently. Mullen loved a downhill runner in Prescott, in Aries Williams. Mullen really emphasized a between the tackles downhill running strong style a lot of the time. And those read options really gravitated towards that. It was either you had the guy who could pound it up the middle really well, or the guy who could keep it and take it off to the outside really well, depending on how the defense was leaning. So Mullen relied a lot on that double-headed rushing attack. And the difference between Mullen and Moorhead ultimately comes down to the usage of personnel, in that Moorhead doesn't employ quite as much of that downhill rushing, but instead it tries to get some running backs and playmakers out in space a lot more. You look at the way he used Saquon Barkley in as many different styles as possible, catching significantly more passes than any Mississippi State running back would, and running to the outside a whole lot more. If you listen to our long preview episode, our part 2 of our SEC preview, you get to hear a guest on the show describe Joe Moorhead's style as being a lot more Chip Kelly influenced than something that Urban Meyer or Dan Mullen would run. And what that means is that Chip Kelly put a lot more emphasis on passing in the offense in a true spread style. In fact, Moorhead is kind of known to always include downfield vertical passing options on nearly every single play. So it's an added read. If a run-pass option, the RPO, as play-by-play guys love to call them now, if the RPO is kind of the go-to play in college football in the spread offense and is, rapidly breaking into the NFL as well, that's a play where you get the ball, you make a read on the defense as to whether or not you have the inside running route, the outside running route, and if you take it if the quarterback keeps it, runs to the outside, he keeps looking downfield before he actually runs. Dan Mullen sticks a lot more with a traditional read option rushing attack, or a lot of times even a triple option rushing attack, but very rarely does he ever call a play in which you have the rush pass option in the way that Chip Kelly likes to do, where Meyer, Mullen gravitate more towards that, traditional rushing, or it's funny to call it traditional because it's all read options, which is still a relatively new thing. Kelly, and then kind of in exchange, Joe Moorhead, really employ those run-pass options a whole lot more. So there will be naturally more passing opportunities for Fitzgerald in a Moorhead offense. Along with that, he's going to use a lot more vertical downfield passing opportunities. This is great news if Fitzgerald wants to take the next step as a quarterback, because it opens up so much more for him. As we mentioned, he's a deadly runner, averaging 6.1 yards per carry his junior year. So to right into an offense where he can take the ball to the outside and scare defenses into maybe making a mistake that he can capitalize on by passing down the field, well, that's huge. Obviously, the questions here are, can he make the right reads? Or is this going to be too much for him to be able to, consistently handle on one play? Coaching style-wise, it seems like Moorhead's offense will work out very, very well for Nick Fitzgerald, and in particular his strengths. His ability to get around a defense and blaze through them, or his ability to hurl a ball over a defender. Much more so than Dan Mullen's, kind of hack and slash offense, typically did. Moorhead's style seems to fit a little bit better, which is promising for Fitzgerald in that regard. What about the personnel around him, though? They bring back an experienced offensive line, missing an all-SEC talent in Martinez Rankin, and that's a huge gap to fill. But there's depth on the line and a lot of experience. And the Mississippi State offensive line did not give up too many sacks last season. Along with that, we mentioned Aries Williams, who is a very powerful runner, very angry style of running, and rising sophomore Kylan Hill, who fits what Joe Moorhead likes in a running back, in that he's versatile, he's great in the open field, but also balanced enough to be able to run between the tackles. The biggest question marks are the wide receivers. Where do they fit into a Joe Moorhead scheme? You got guys like Dedrick Thomas, a little bit shorter, but a quick, shifty wide receiver. You got guys like Jamal Crouch, a bigger guy that people are expecting, to have more of a role in the offense moving forward. I think I just called him Crouch when it's actually Jamal Couch. Whoops. But he's a, 6'4", 220-pound wide receiver who you got to think would be a bit more of a physical threat on some of those run-pass options that you expect to see in the Moorhead offense. The most interesting thing here is what Joe Moorhead will decide to do with some players like Malik Deer, Keith Mixon, and the aforementioned Kylan Hill. These are all guys that kind of play half running back, half wide receiver. Deer and Mixon in particular happen to be a little bit shorter, under 6 feet tall, but quick playmaker type of players, more so than they are, fitting any particular position or style. Malik Deer, for example, may only be, 5'10", but he checks in at, almost 230 pounds himself, while also being quick and shifty, having been basically the focal point for his high school team's entire offense before he went to Mississippi State. These are versatile playmakers that Joe Moorhead will look to use probably in a lot of different ways, if they all stay healthy, of course. Malik Deer is coming back from a pretty bad injury. But for Fitzgerald to succeed, he's going to have to take advantage of the weapons around him. It's not just him. It'll be more spread out maybe than it ever has been under Dan Mullen, now that Moorhead's in charge, just because there's more talent there. So the personnel around Fitzgerald is maybe the biggest question mark. I mean, right now you've got big pluses in his speed, arm strength, and the style of coaching, style of offense that Moorhead tends to run. Then you've got weaknesses in his touch control. Obviously, coming back from a bad injury is a major thing. But also, question marks in how the rest of the personnel around him, in particular those wide receivers, are going to respond to this offense. So finally, let's compare Fitzgerald at this point in his career with some of the other quarterbacks that, make sense to compare him to. The first obviously has to be the man he replaced, Dak Prescott. Prescott very quietly in his senior year threw for almost 4,000 yards on 66% completion. And that's really what pushed Dak into the NFL more than anything else, is that he proved he could be an efficient enough quarterback. There were big questions going into his senior year of whether or not, he had the pocket presence to go and be a pro. So it was very evident that Dan Mullen made it a point to put him in the pocket a lot more. He rushed the ball significantly less than he did his junior year, 160 times compared to 210 times. He threw the ball significantly more than he did, 477 times compared to 396 times. And he succeeded in that. 66% completion, almost 4,000 yards. It was about 3,800, 29 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. As we mentioned before, Fitzgerald, on the other hand, has never really topped 55% completion percentage, insignificant amount of playing time. He's got, lower yards per pass, fewer touchdowns, more interceptions, but he's also typically attempted, much fewer passes than Prescott has up until, this point in his career. He's rushed the ball just kind of better, flat out. So what can you expect to see? If he's coming out of that, and he's coming out of an offense that really propelled Dak Prescott to stardom, then what can he expect if we looked at, for example, Trace McSorley, the guy that Joe Moorhead has just been working with? McSorley doesn't run the ball nearly as well. In the past 2 seasons at least, 2016 he's had 146 carries for 365 yards, 2017 144 carries for 491 yards. Those are both tallies or averages of 2.5 and 3.4 yards per carry. 7 touchdowns, 11 touchdowns, respectively. So right then and there, if you compared those attempts to Fitzgerald, you have 195 Fitzgerald sophomore year 2016, 162 last season before the injury, 7.1 yards per carry, 6.1 yards per carry. So you've got more rushing attempts, albeit not significantly more last season before the injury occurred. Only, less than 20 more attempts. I believe it's 18 if my math is correct. More yardage, more touchdowns, and a much, much higher average. But if under Moorhead, McSorley is, he was not as good a runner, but if he's not rushing as often, then what's he doing with the ball in the air? Well, here is where the most significant thing happened. You see, in 2016, Trace McSorley, as a sophomore, really was not drastically different than Nick Fitzgerald in a lot of ways. He had fewer interceptions and more touchdowns, but he also attempted more passes, albeit not a huge amount more. He attempted 387 compared to Fitzgerald's 361. So there's a few more plays that, were in McSorley's hands as far as passing goes, while there would have been a few more, based on his feet for Fitzgerald. And in 2016, McSorley threw for 3,614 yards, 9.3 yards per attempt. Very good averages there. But notably, he only completed 58% of his passes, just a few percentage marks more than Fitzgerald has up to this point in his career. It's the jump from sophomore to junior year that really stands out for Trace McSorley. It was fewer yards in the air, 3,570. It was a smaller average, 8.4 yards. It actually was one less touchdown and 2 more interceptions, but the completion percentage skyrocketed almost 10%. If he went from 57.9% in sophomore year, in his junior year he jumped up to 66.5%. So just looking at that, you can see that the more comfortable he was able to get in the offense, and especially with these RPOs, that's the trendy way to call it, and all these run-pass options that Moorhead likes to call, really benefited McSorley in that he was able to complete a better percentage. McSorley, quite obviously, had one of the best players, if not the best player in college football last season, Saquon Barkley, hanging out with him, and that's significant. But just for comparison's sake, Saquon Barkley rushed the ball less than Aries Williams did for Mississippi State and had just a tiny bit more yardage. He rushed the ball 217 times for 1,271 yards, a 5.9 per carry attempt, which is amazing, and 18 touchdowns. Whereas Aries Williams actually rushed the ball more, 236 times, 1,107 yards, 6 touchdowns, 4.7 yards per carry, and there's the difference. And I like that in this comparison, 4.7 yards per carry is somehow like a bad number. So as we noted, just kind of in general, Penn State didn't run the ball any more than Mississippi State did. They passed the ball, more often, which means that McSorley was able to take advantage of this system to actually complete a significantly higher amount of passes. And that's the strength of the Joe Moorhead offense, is that the balance shines. If the potential is there for a big jump, like what happened with Trace McSorley going into his junior year in terms of completion percentage, then that's going to be ultimately the key for Nick Fitzgerald this season. Joe Moorhead seems like the type of guy who can bring in the offense that fits more for Fitzgerald's skill set, but then also maybe the tutelage to teach him how to maximize that. And this is maybe the most important part past this season, is that this will help Fitzgerald really fit that, archetype of quarterback in the professional ranks for the future. The Carson Wentzes, the Dak Prescotts, the guys that a lot of teams are really embracing and going after are the guys that are big physical runners that can really handle those run-pass options successfully. I mean, heck, Nick Foles was able to use that sort of system well enough to, complete what Wentz started and win a Super Bowl. If Fitzgerald can reach Nick Foles' level of, NFL competence, then if he lands in the right system, he's golden. And that's why the Joe Moorhead hire is really, really significant for the future of the quarterbacks at Mississippi State. Because if the NFL continues this trend of adopting more run-pass options and more spread offense aspects, then quarterbacks that fit this mold will be able to make the transition very, very easily. There is a lot of work that still needs to be done when it comes to Nick Fitzgerald's game and rounding that out. But there are a lot of accomplishments that he's already achieved. There's a lot of strengths, and there's a lot that could translate very, very well moving forward. So if the spotlight is on Fitzgerald, the question is whether or not he's going to put in the work necessary to do what needs to be done, but also whether or not Moorhead is going to be able to focus him enough in the style and in his strengths to maximize what he can do. Nick Fitzgerald's a very good football player, but if there's anything that this deep dive into his strengths, weaknesses, statistics, and the coaching style has shown us, it's that this is the moment, this is the season where he can really become a great quarterback, first and foremost. The foundation is, it's actually there. So maybe all this hype that, a lot of people are giving him is genuine. And maybe it'll be what will push him to succeed. But it's that sort of hype that also can, lead to a player not achieving what they need to, struggling to adapt. I mean, it still is a coaching change. Who cares if it's a more favorable system? I mean, this is a transition, and it's going to be difficult for any team to adapt to a brand new coaching staff in 1 year and instantly succeed on the same level they have or even do better. So if there's anything we know now, it's how they can improve, how Fitzgerald can improve, how Moorhead can help him improve. And the only question that's left is, will they pull it off? Thanks for tuning into this deep dive into what it'll take to make Nick Fitzgerald's senior year a phenomenal one. For more podcasts like this, for more previews of the 2018 SEC football season, or more just shenanigans in general, you got to make sure you subscribe to this podcast, Running Out the Clock. You can find us wherever podcasts are found. That's right, we're on the iTunes Store, the Google Play Music Store, Spotify, and our hosting home, Podbean. Check out our website, rotc.podbean.com, where you'll be able to find everything we have, including written material, blog posts, and some other breakdowns right there. As always, it really helps if you leave us a good rating, a good review on wherever it is that you're listening to help us get out there and reach more people that would be interested in this sort of topic. Thank you again for listening to Running Out the Clock. I'm your friend Joseph Craven. I'll see you next time.